We're going to talk briefly about two new religions. So we've talked a lot this semester about old religions, traditional religions, in many cases religions that have been around for thousands of years. And we're going to end the semester talking about some new religions. As you know, especially with the syncretism of modern times, with lots of things mixing more than they've mixed in the past, social media, the internet, and everything else, lots of new religions have arisen. Lots are probably currently arising that we don't recognize as distinct religions yet. Now, because there's so many, we can't cover them all. We're going to cover two representative samples to try to get a smattering, a small smattering of what new religions can look like. Okay, so here you have a picture, if you're wondering, of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. So first, we will eventually talk about Scientology. First, we're going to talk about the Yoruba tradition. And this is a tradition that informed lots of new religions in the Americas and the Caribbean. So what happened was in West Africa, what's today mostly Nigeria, there was the Yoruba religion. And of course, when the slave trade started and lots of Africans were brought as slaves to the New World, they brought their religion with them. But then, as is very common in these sorts of situations, there was a mixing and a melding and a sort of what's called syncretism, where two religious traditions mix, because as the slaves got to the New World, there was a heavy Catholic influence. And so you got the Yoruba mixing with Catholicism, and you get eventually this sort of new thing. And there's three different strands of it as it developed in different countries, but that's called Santeria in Cuba. There's a Sublime song about that. Voodoo in Haiti and Candomblé in Brazil. But in each case, it's the result of Yoruba mixing with Catholicism, various different kinds of Catholicism, right? But Catholicism nonetheless. Okay, so before we get into some of the specifics, which we're going to kind of go at 30,000 feet over and see just the general specifics, we need to ask this question. A lot of scholars disagree about this question. Was it true syncretism or was it dissimulation? Okay, so there's some jargon for you. What we're asking here is, so there's normal cases of syncretism happen when two cultures collide, right? And what's going on in a lot of cases is that these two traditions meld in such a way that the new religion that comes out of them is kind of not equal parts, but has both previous traditions as parts and as genuine parts, as not being faked, or one religion is not hiding in the other, metaphorically, so to speak. They're a genuine mixture of two previous traditions in this new religion. So that happens all over the place. Especially in places where at least historically trade routes have run through and lots of different religions or traditions have come together. You could argue that there was syncretism at work in the background of the development of Islam, for example, because Muhammad had experienced so many different religions, from Zoroastrianism to Christianity to Judaism. And in fact, you can see how he incorporated different elements of those things. And even the practice of visiting Mecca was drawn from older, in many cases, even polytheistic religions, right? So you could see that as a kind of syncretism. And what's unique about syncretism as opposed to dissimulation is that none of that is like playing pretend, right? The pilgrimage to Mecca is for real. The aspects of Judaism and Christianity, the stories about Noah and Moses and all those, they're not for pretend, they're for real. That's part of the Quran and part of Muslim religion. Now, oppose that to something else that can happen, where one religion can hide in another religion, so to speak. That's just a metaphor. But what's happening there is there's a new religion that has elements of two different religions, but really what's going on is the adherents of a religion are being persecuted or oppressed in some way by a different religion or by adherence to a different religion. And so they will take on the trappings or the appearance of that other religion. And in many cases, they'll adapt their former religion so that it can kind of look more like this new religion, but it's disingenuous. They don't really mean it on some level. They're just trying to escape persecution. And so it looks like syncretism because there's a new religion that has elements of two religions, but really it's something else happening. The dominant religion, the aspects of the dominant religion are not truly honest parts of that religion, right? The person is just trying to escape persecution by making the religion, or the culture is just trying to escape persecution by making their religion look more like a different religion. So this happened in various parts of the world with Jews, where I'm thinking of Jews in Spain who had to, or Jews in various parts of the world who were forced to convert to Christianity. They would often kind of, this happened with Karl Marx's dad, actually, who was forced to convert to Christianity, but kind of just did it on the surface. Now, that's a slightly different thing from a whole religion being changed to dissimulate, to kind of simulate a different religion. But this is going to happen whenever one religious, or it's likely to happen whenever one religious tradition is being kind of oppressed by a different, more powerful religious tradition, right? So sometimes people will just wholesale switch over to the new religion. That has happened many times in history. Sometimes they'll refuse to grant any ground. That has happened a lot of times in history, and in many cases they'll be wiped out, right? Again, if you look at the history of Israel, this has happened with the Jews when they refused to submit to the Roman Empire, and the Romans conquered them and destroyed the temple, the second temple, that is. But then there's this third thing that can happen, which we're calling here dissimulation, which they're not really wholesale converting to the new religion. They're not really standing their ground fully and refusing to grant any ground to the new religion, but they are trying to, maybe not even consciously, but the old religion comes to look like the new religion, but in a kind of disingenuous way, right? Just to escape persecution. And they're trying to maintain the old religion primarily. Okay, so with that conceptual framework in the background, there is debate because these were slaves. They were not in a position of power. They were in a position of being oppressed. There's a question of to what extent the Catholic elements of these new religions is truly genuine and not just dissimulation, right? So what we have, as we'll see in just a minute, is these new kinds of religions, which in many ways do look a lot like Catholic religions. They have saints, they have a one God, right? But in many cases, it's going to look like you could at least make the case that the old elements of the religion are just being housed and hidden in Catholic terminology. Now, there is scholarly debate about that, because a lot of people will say, no, that's not really what's happening. It's just a true syncretism. The people practicing these religions really do, hold the Catholic elements of their religion. So let's look at the tradition or the religion a little bit more closely. So one similarity that these new religions have with Catholicism is that there is one God, but the old element, the Yoruba element, is that this is an impersonal God, not really involved with human beings or really caring to be involved. Okay. So the other main element that we're going to focus on here is that in the Yoruba tradition, you had these demigods or gods, maybe even, called orishas. So there was one supreme god in the Yoruba tradition, but there were lots of other gods. So that's a very non-Catholic way of thinking of it. And the orishas, they were kind of like the gods of Greek or Roman mythology. They were associated in many cases with various natural phenomena like lightning or the ocean or a mountain or whatever, and in many cases with trades like metallurgy or whatever. And they were genuine gods. They were actually divine, right? And in the Yoruba tradition, the gods would often come into a person, right, and take over their body, and that's how the person would have this experience and how the god would sometimes communicate. There were sacrifices. This is not on the slide, but you had to make blood sacrifices to these orishas, and there's actually some interesting court cases, Supreme Court cases in the U.S. where this was deemed that, for example, practitioners of Santeria had the right to do this, to make animal sacrifices because of freedom of religion. But as these new religions developed, these Orishas came to take on more of the personality and traits of Catholic saints. So they have the names and visages or appearances of Catholic saints. And just as Catholics will ask the saints to pray for them, the practitioners of these religions will kind of pray to the Orishas and have them intervene on their behalf. So you don't really interact with God directly. It's via these Orishas, or, that have the names and appearances of Catholic saints. Okay, so that's the new religions that developed out of the Yoruba tradition. Let's go on and talk about one second new religion that has developed very recently, much more recently even than this tradition in America. This is not even close to 100 years old. L. Ron Hubbard founded Scientology in 1954, so we're not even at the 70-year mark yet, right? Hubbard was a science fiction writer before he did this, and then he founded Scientology in 1954. So let's talk about some of the main elements of Scientology, and then let me just outline those sort of features, and then I'm going to, hopefully you'll start seeing some close analogs or similarities to things we've already talked about, other major religions, but I'll outline those once we get to the bottom. So according to Scientologists, the human person is primarily an immaterial soul called a thetan. Okay, so not only that, but your body, and in fact, the material world in general, is kind of hostile to the soul. It's an impediment. It's a barrier to be gotten over. So you're a soul, you're a thetan, and MEST, that stands for matter, energy, space, and time, including the human body, but encompassing all of matter and space and time and energy, is actually an obstacle. It's entrapping your thetan, your soul. And the goal of your soul is liberation from MEST. And how do you get that liberation? Well, it's via some kind of enlightenment or renewed perception. You have to work past the barriers of the physical world. What does that work consist of? Well, it's kind of mental work, right? It's work on your own perception and on your own enlightenment, and tearing down certain barriers, materially speaking. Now, so far, let's take a break. So far, this should sound similar to a lot of other religions, especially Eastern religions, but not only Eastern religions. For example, samsara is a kind of Buddhist Hindu concept of this continual cycle of rebirth and in the physical world, being trapped in the physical world. And similarly, your soul needs to be freed of that cycle and of the bondage of the physical world in what's often called nirvana. That's exactly what's happening here in Scientology, and Scientology has taken a cue very strongly from that. Now, there's also non-Eastern religions, which Scientology bears a strong similarity to. There's an early Christian heresy that is non-authoritative, sort of condemned by the mainstream Christian church view, called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was the view that we were primarily immaterial souls and that the material world was evil. Gnostics, in fact, part of why it was such a heresy was that they were committed to the claim that Jesus, well, many of them followed Gnosticism to what they considered its conclusion, that Jesus could not have had a real human body, because the human body is evil and it is limiting and it is a prison. And so they said Jesus was a hologram. It's not all Gnostics, but some Gnostics endorse this claim. He just seemed to have a human body, but he didn't. Otherwise, he couldn't have really been God or divine in any way, right? The human body is evil. Now, a lot of people do associate this sort of thinking with Christianity in general, but that's only a relatively recent phenomena. Historically, the Christian church has been very anti-Gnostic, and and against the sort of thinking presented here in Scientology and in Hinduism and Buddhism. The human body is in Judeo-Christian traditions and is not presented as an evil thing or as something that is necessarily an obstacle to human life. In fact, if you read the book of Genesis, just to put all of this in contrast, the human body is presented as part of the ideal state. Humans are created embodied in the Garden of Eden. So that should help put Scientology in contrast to the Christian tradition, but then similarity with the Christian heresy of Gnosticism, right? So the Gnostics actually thought that God did not actually create the material world. There was this thing called the demiurge, which it's unclear. This came from the Neoplatonists, right? The Gnosticism was ultimately an influence of Greek philosophy, Platonism that had kind of been modified by later people following Plato. And they thought that there was this demiurge that had created the material world to sort of kind of deceive people and keep them away from God. So that the material world was deceptive and was contrary to true knowledge. And so the Gnostics thought, similarly to Scientologists, that the way to get free of the physical world was by some sort of special, in many cases, secret knowledge. And this is exactly, I say all of this because this is exactly what Scientologists think. They think that you need to get free of the physical world. How do you do that? It's by some sort of secret knowledge. How do you get that secret knowledge? How do you get past the barrier of your physicality? Well, it's via sort of counseling sessions with what are called auditors. They're spiritual counselors. And these are actually not free sessions. You actually have to pay for these sessions. And those auditors in various ways can measure what are called the engrams, or the blockages in your body to enlightenment. And sometimes that's as simple as sort of like normal kind of counseling session where, you talk through, you try to advise someone on sort of mental or spiritual practices that they could engage in to get past those blockages. But sometimes there's lots of pseudoscience sort of involved where the person actually has a physical thing called an e-meter, right? You could look this up on YouTube. That is a meter, like an actual meter they hook up to your body, and they can read your skin response, supposedly, and tell where the engrams are and how many you have, right? And that's when those are the pre-clears. That's what they call the people who are sort of the initiates, right? The people who have not yet achieved enlightenment. You're clear, you're a clear or an operating thetan once you've gotten past those blockages. Okay, so we're going to stop there. That's sort of where Scientology ends up. Hopefully that points out a lot of the similarities with Eastern religions and also, in this case, Christian heresies that Scientology has and was almost surely drawn from.